China, the complete betrayal of Marxism-Leninism. Preamble, method before claim. Before a single assertion is made, the method must be declared. This essay operates exclusively through descriptive structural mapping. Every claim traces back to directly observable institutional facts. Every conclusion derives only from what the evidence structurally demonstrates. No floating signifiers, no authority appeals, no normative premises smuggled as descriptive facts. Two structural definitions will serve as the measuring instruments: Marxism-Leninism and fascism, each defined by their observable institutional requirements, not their rhetorical self-presentation. The People's Republic of China will then be mapped against both definitions through direct, observable evidence. The conclusion will not be asserted, it will be derived. Part 1. Defining the instruments. Marxism-Leninism. Structural requirements, not as ideology, not as aspiration, as observable institutional structure. Proletarian internationalism. The working class has no nation. National borders are bourgeois instruments of class division. A Marxist-Leninist state's primary obligation is world-class struggle superseding national interest. Any foreign policy subordinating international proletarian solidarity to national development is structural deviation by definition. Dictatorship of the proletariat through Soviets. Workers hold state power directly through recallable delegates, workplace assemblies, and mass participation in planning. The Vanguard Party is a temporary instrument organizing workers toward direct power, not a permanent ruling apparatus substituting itself for workers. A state where workers have no structural mechanism to recall or remove leadership is not a dictatorship of the proletariat, regardless of what it calls itself. Expropriation of capital, P. Private ownership of means of production is the target of revolutionary transformation, not a development strategy. Capital accumulation by private individuals is the structural enemy of the system, not its engine. A state that protects, encourages, and partners with private capital accumulation has structurally inverted this requirement. Planning driven by social need. Resource allocation decisions are made on the basis of collectively determined social need, not profit signals. Production targets serve human requirements, not capital returns. A state whose enterprises operate on profit metrics has abandoned this structural requirement regardless of state ownership percentages. Fascism. Structural requirements. Again, not as slur. As observable institutional structure, ultranationalism as organizing principle, national identity explicitly supersedes class identity as the primary political organizing framework. The nation, not the class, is the fundamental unit of political mobilization. State ideology frames national restoration, national greatness, or national identity as the supreme political goal. Corporate state, private property relations maintained under state strategic direction. Private ownership preserved while state coordinates capital toward national development goals. The structural relationship between private capital and state apparatus is partnership, not antagonism. Permanent single-party apparatus. One party holds state power, with no legal structural mechanism for peaceful removal or transfer of power outside the party. Dissent is criminalized. Leadership permanence is institutionally protected. Ethnic nationalist project. State apparatus mobilized around specific ethnic or national identity claims. Minority populations subject to assimilation, suppression, or elimination in service of dominant national identity construction. Expansionist foreign policy, serving national capital. International engagement structured around national capital accumulation and geopolitical dominance, not ideological solidarity or universal principles. These are the instruments. Purely structural, purely descriptive. Now the mapping begins. Part 2. Internationalism. Complete structural inversion. Lenin was unambiguous. The revolution was singular and world. National borders were bourgeois instruments. A socialist state's survival was inseparable from the world proletariat's victory. Supporting revolutionary movements everywhere was not optional foreign policy, it was structural requirement. Observable Chinese foreign policy. 1972, Nixon visits Beijing. The People's Republic normalizes relations with the primary imperial power on Earth, while that same power is actively bombing Vietnam, a neighboring socialist state. The strategic calculation is explicitly national. China seeks a counterweight to Soviet pressure. world proletarian solidarity is structurally subordinated to Chinese national interest in a single observable diplomatic event. 1970s onward, socialism with Chinese characteristics formally replaces universal Marxist-Leninist doctrine as state ideology. The linguistic shift is not cosmetic, it is the formal declaration that Chinese national development supersedes universal class struggle as the organizing principle of the state. Belt and Road Initiative, observable structure is commercial infrastructure expansion generating debt dependencies serving Chinese capital accumulation and geopolitical influence. Not a single element of the program is structured around proletarian solidarity. Partner nations are selected for strategic resource access and market penetration. Revolutionary movements receive no structural support. The program is indistinguishable from 19th-century imperial capital export, described by Lenin himself as the highest stage of capitalism. UN Security Council. China systematically uses veto power to protect capitalist states it maintains commercial relationships with. Observable voting record shows consistent protection of state sovereignty over revolutionary movements. The institution Lenin would have identified as the primary instrument of imperialist coordination receives Chinese protection when commercial interests require it. Conditional mapping. Under Marxist-Leninist internationalism, national interest is structurally subordinate to world proletarian struggle. Under observable Chinese foreign policy, world proletarian struggle is structurally subordinate to national interest without exception. Chain verdict, not drift, not compromise, complete structural inversion of the foundational requirement. Part 3. Workers' democracy, structural negation. The Soviet model was not bureaucratic administration with revolutionary branding. It was a specific institutional structure. Workers held power directly through councils with recallable delegates. Workplace assemblies participated in planning decisions. The Vanguard Party organized workers toward direct power, never substituting itself as permanent ruler. Observable Chinese institutional structure, Soviets, non-existent, no workers' councils with actual state power, no recallable delegates, no workplace assemblies with structural decision-making authority. The institutional form that gives Marxist-Leninist workers democracy, its observable content, has never existed in the People's Republic. Trade unions. The All-China Federation of Trade Unions is a state apparatus, not a workers' organization. Independent trade unions are illegal. Strike leaders face imprisonment. The observable function of the labor relation structure is management of workers on behalf of state and capital, not representation of workers against capital. Tiananmen Square. 1989, workers and students demanding structural accountability were physically crushed by state military apparatus. The observable event is a state using maximum violence against workers demanding the institutional forms Marxism-Leninism requires. The class character of state violence was unambiguous. Workers demanded power. The state destroyed them. Term limits. Xi Jinping removed presidential term limits in 2018. Permanent personal leadership was constitutionally institutionalized. No structural mechanism exists for workers to remove, recall, or constrain leadership. The observable trajectory is toward greater permanence of ruling apparatus, not transitional movement toward workers' direct power. Xi Jinping thought, mandatory ideological education across all institutions, dissent criminalized through expanding national security legislation. Hong Kong's legal autonomy destroyed through national security law imposing criminal penalties for political expression. Observable function is elimination of structural space for challenge to ruling apparatus. Conditional mapping. Under Marxist-Leninist workers' democracy, workers hold direct recallable structural power over state apparatus through observable institutional forms. Under observable CCP governance, workers have zero structural mechanism to recall, remove, or constrain ruling apparatus. The institutional forms of workers' democracy have never existed. Chain verdict, not failed implementation, not distortion under pressure. Structural negation from the beginning. Part 4. Capital expropriation, structural reversal. Capital expropriation is not a rhetorical position. It is a structural requirement with observable institutional content. Private ownership of means of production is identified as the fundamental mechanism of class exploitation. Its elimination is not optional reform. It is the structural definition of socialist transformation. Observable Chinese economic structure, billionaire concentration. China has produced more dollar billionaires than any country except the United States. This is not an unfortunate side effect of socialist construction. It is the direct, observable result of explicit state policy encouraging private capital accumulation as national development strategy. Constitutional protection. Private property rights were constitutionally protected in 2004. The state apparatus explicitly guaranteed the legal framework for private capital accumulation at the highest structural level available. This is the structural opposite of expropriation. Stock markets, Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchanges have operated since 1990. Capital markets where private ownership of productive assets is bought and sold have been central to Chinese economic structure for over 3 decades. Observable function is private capital accumulation through ownership of means of production. Special economic zones, foreign capital was explicitly invited, legally protected, and structurally integrated into Chinese development strategy from 1978 onward. The state apparatus created institutional spaces specifically designed to attract and protect the private international capital that Marxist-Leninist analysis identifies as the primary mechanism of imperialist exploitation. Private enterprise scale, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, and thousands of other private corporations represent massive concentrations of privately owned productive capital explicitly encouraged by state policy. Jack Ma accumulated personal wealth exceeding the GDP of many nations under a system calling itself communist. State-owned enterprises operate on profit metrics, not social need. Observable behavior is indistinguishable from capitalist enterprise. They compete in markets, pursue profit, and shed workers when economically convenient. Social need planning is not their observable operating principle. Conditional mapping. Under Marxist-Leninist economics, private capital accumulation is the structural target of revolutionary transformation. Under observable Chinese economics, private capital accumulation is an explicit state development strategy protected at constitutional level. Chain verdict, structural reversal so complete it represents the mirror image of the requirement. Part 5, mapping against fascism. Having established complete structural divergence from Marxism-Leninism across every core requirement, the second mapping can now proceed. Ultranationalism. Xi Jinping. Thought centers the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as the supreme political objective. This is not rhetorical decoration. It is the explicit organizing principle of state ideology replacing universal class struggle. The observable content of political mobilization is national restoration, not class liberation. Han nationalism is structurally embedded in state ideology. Chinese national identity is constructed around specific ethnic and cultural content. Political legitimacy derives from national restoration narrative built around the century of humiliation, a framework organizing state identity entirely around national grievance and restoration, not class analysis. Conditional mapping. Under fascist ultranationalism, national identity explicitly supersedes class identity as primary political organizing principle. Under observable CCP ideology, national rejuvenation explicitly supersedes class struggle as primary political organizing principle. Chain verdict. Direct structural match. Corporate state. Private property maintained. State directs private capital toward national strategic goals. Tech billionaires serve on political advisory bodies while maintaining private ownership. State-owned enterprises operate on profit metrics in market competition, foreign capital integrated into national development strategy. Jack Ma's public disappearance, following criticism of state financial regulation, demonstrates the observable relationship precisely. Private capital is permitted and encouraged within boundaries of state strategic direction. Deviation from those boundaries produces state disciplinary response. The structure is not socialism, it is state-directed capitalism. The observable institutional relationship between private capital and state apparatus is partnership with state primacy, the definitional structure of the fascist corporate state. Conditional mapping. Under fascist corporate state, private ownership maintained under state strategic direction. Under observable Chinese political economy, private ownership maintained under state strategic direction. Chain verdict. Structural identity. Permanent single-party apparatus. CCP has held uncontested state power since 1949. No legal mechanism exists for peaceful transfer of power outside the party. Term limits removed in 2018, institutionalizing personal permanent leadership. Dissent criminalized through expanding national security legislation. Observable trajectory is toward greater, not lesser, permanence of ruling apparatus. Conditional mapping. Under fascist single-party state, permanent ruling apparatus with no structural removal mechanism. Under observable CCP governance, permanent ruling apparatus with no structural removal mechanism. Chain verdict, structural identity. Ethnic nationalist project. Xinjiang. Observable evidence of systematic cultural destruction targeting Uyghur population. Mass detention facilities. Forced cultural assimilation programs. Destruction of religious and cultural institutions. Demographic engineering through population transfers. The scale and systematic character of the program represents state apparatus mobilized around ethnic identity suppression in service of Han national identity construction. Tibet, decades of demographic engineering, cultural suppression and religious institution control represent the same structural pattern. Minority cultural identity subordinated to Han national identity through state apparatus. Conditional mapping. Under fascist ethnic nationalist project, state apparatus mobilized to suppress minority identity in service of dominant national identity construction. Under observable Chinese state behavior, state apparatus systematically mobilized to suppress minority identity in service of Han national identity construction. Chain verdict. Direct structural match. Part 6. The masquerade mechanism. The most important structural observation is not the betrayal itself. It is the precision of the concealment. The vocabulary was retained with surgical care: Communist Party, People's Republic, socialism with Chinese characteristics, Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, the proletariat, the masses, class struggle, every word of the original framework preserved, every structural referent those words pointed to systematically dismantled and replaced with their structural opposites. This is not accidental. It is the most sophisticated application of the information asymmetry mechanism observable in modern political history. The population sees communism because the word remains. The population lives inside fascism because the structure replaced it. Without the tools to audit the chain behind the words, without the ability to trace vocabulary back to its structural reference and verify whether those references still exist, the masquerade is impenetrable. Most of the world's population, including most of China's own population, lacks those auditing tools. The educational sequence ensuring philosophical prerequisites never develop before domain knowledge installs itself guarantees this. A population that cannot audit chains cannot see that the chains were replaced while the labels remained. The linguistic engineering was therefore not propaganda in the crude sense of obvious lies. It was precision semantic manipulation. Using the full ontological weight of revolutionary vocabulary, words forged in genuine struggle, carrying genuine historical meaning, while systematically emptying them of their structural content and replacing that content with the structural opposite. Marx called this mystification, the process by which real social relations are concealed behind ideological representations that serve ruling class interests. The People's Republic of China represents the most complete and consequential mystification operation in the history of Marxism itself. Conclusion: the derived structural finding. The complete structural mapping produces one finding: against Marxism-Leninism, internationalism, completely structurally inverted, national interest replaced world Bertrandson solidarity as organizing principle without exception, workers' democracy structurally negated. The institutional forms of workers' direct power have never existed in the People's Republic. Capital expropriation, structurally reversed. Private capital accumulation is explicit state development strategy protected at constitutional level. Social need planning, structurally abandoned. State enterprises operate on profit metrics. Market allocation replace need-based planning. Against fascism, ultranationalism, direct structural match. National rejuvenation is the supreme explicit political objective. Corporate state, direct structural match. Private ownership maintained under state strategic direction with disciplinary apparatus enforcing boundaries. Permanent single-party apparatus, direct structural match. No structural removal mechanism exists or has ever existed. Ethnic nationalist project, direct structural match. state apparatus systematically mobilized for Han identity construction through minority suppression. The purely descriptive conclusion derived from complete structural mapping. The People's Republic of China matches the structural definition of fascism more precisely across more dimensions than it matches the structural definition of Marxism-Leninism across any dimension. The betrayal was not ideological evolution, it was not pragmatic adaptation to material conditions, it was not socialism with Chinese characteristics, it was the systematic replacement of every structural requirement of Marxism-Leninism with its structural opposite while retaining the complete vocabulary of the original. The most complete betrayal in the history of the framework, executed with precision, concealed through language, and sustained for over 7 decades through the information asymmetry between those who control the chains and those who were never given the tools to audit them.